a 3-year, very ambitious study to investigate the prospects and the obstacles for sustainable lifestyles and green economy in Europe through to 2050. And so today we are going to be focusing on the aspects of modeling and measuring sustainable lifestyle transitions through to 2050 and the big trends and innovations that can actually give us a stronger sense of what really works within particular systems and domains, in particular food, energy, living and mobility, and also how those domains and systems connect and how interventions and innovations in one area can actually have a direct implication on the overall scenarios that we develop in areas. So I will take about 5 to 7 minutes just to give a very quick context set for today's project. I'll go to the next slide. Thank you. And then I'm going to hand over directly to a dear friend and colleague in Cranfield University in the UK, Professor Liz Varga, who's the director of the Complex Systems Research Centre there, and who has been leading on the design and the road testing of an agent-based model to look at the potential impacts of sustainable lifestyles innovation through to 2050. And then when Liz has finished the presentation of the emerging evidence and findings of her work and how this model actually works, we'll have time for a few questions and comments from those of you who would like to get points of clarification or more details. And then at 4 o'clock we'll have a hard close with a quick summary of next steps in the project and a word about our final conference. So, thank you, Marcus. So, sustainable lifestyle at EU level. Where does the EU-InnovatE project come from? Well, it's really rooted in 3 headline policy objectives that the European Commission adopted back in 2010 as a framework for the next 10 years of policy development and objectives at EU level. The first being smart, sustainable and inclusive growth in the single market. The second being attempting to get their heads around how one manages an aging population of 500+ million people while reducing levels of resource use and energy and transport as systems surrounding this huge community. And the third, and perhaps most relevant, was to challenge some of the orthodoxies about consumption and production systems in Europe and how a new set of models and approaches could be the catalyst for a transition to a low-carbon economy by 2050. And within this context, our project is actually rooted in the findings of a social platform that the Commission funded in 2011 and 2012 called Spread 2050, which develops a number of scenarios through which per capita resource consumption in the EU could be reduced from its current 25 to 40,000 kilos to 8,000 kilos by 2050, which was seen as one of the key indicators of sustainability of socio-economic and socio-ecological systems. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So in late 2012, the Commission put out a research call for proposals, which challenged the European research community to look at the following 4 dimensions of sustainable living and green economy in Europe through to 2050. So the first is I think, very closely aligned with what we're talking about today. It's the links between different systems and their influence on consumers' values and behavior. We'll hear more from Liz in a short while about how this plays out at the level of households and the use of different modeling methodologies. The second big question was, what are the obstacles and opportunities associated with these transitions in obviously a very uncertain set of pathways through to 2050? Third, and I think also a very interesting part of what we've been examining in this project, is around the new business models to manage natural resources and to accelerate change within existing consumption production systems, so that there is a demonstrable positive impact on quality of life in Europe. And last but not least, it was about measuring and modeling the prospects for sustainable lifestyles and the trends through to 2050, or the innovations, as we more specifically refer to them, that would actually give policymakers some hard data to shape their decision-making on where to prioritize innovation and intervention around markets to promote more sustainable living in Europe. Next slide. So we were very happy in late 2012 that Technische Universität München and School of Management, under the leadership of Professor Frank Martin Belt, put themselves forward as the coordinator of the following group of institutions that you see in front of you, a number of Europe's leading universities and business schools, and supporting networks and research institutes. So together, this is the group of partners that has been delivering the EU-InnovatE project for the last 2.75 years and is now accelerating towards our conclusion at the end of 2016. Okay, next slide. So again, what is the key idea behind our project? What differentiated our proposal from others that were submitted to you? Well, in a nutshell, it is this, that we are exploring what we see as an emerging phenomenon, which is the creative, innovative, and entrepreneurial roles of users, of citizens, and arguably other types of community or virtual innovation platforms in developing the kind of sustainable products, services, and systems that will support this model of sustainable lifestyles in Europe, or Sustainable Lifestyles 2.0, as we refer to it. And this, of course, challenges the classical model. Actually, let's go to the next slide, please. Of 20th century consumption, production, and consumerism thinking, which you see on the graph in front of you. So in the bottom left quadrant, arguably the dominant model of the 20th century of passive users of products and services, very fragmented individual users, being engaged with large companies on the back of marketing and mass consumption techniques that led to a classic consumerism, whereby the big companies and the state-owned innovation processes and users and consumers were largely excluded from this at multiple levels. But with the advent of new media, open access data and more, and new technologies, what we perceived is a shift towards the upper right quadrant, where we have users and consumers who are now starting to partner with each other outside of major corporate innovation systems, and empowered by new technologies, new platforms, are starting to develop new communities of innovation, which is leading to them becoming the co-producers of these solutions and services that may help to accelerate our transition towards these sustainable futures as identified by Spread 2050 and next slide. So, in brief, this is the research design of the EU-InnovatE project. 6 major work packages grounded in empirical work and scientific analysis. We have looked so far at the past and present of sustainable lifestyles in Europe and sustainable consumption production systems. We've also looked at the heart of the project, which is the large company approach to open innovation, integrating users and citizens and entrepreneurs, and also some of these new dynamics of citizen entrepreneurs and innovators creating new businesses and organizations for wider social and environmental benefits. And so today's webinar focuses on work package 5, measuring the trends for sustainable lifestyles 2.0. And with that, I will now move on. I will now gladly hand over to Professor Liz Varga at Cranfield University, who is going to talk us through the design, the development of the model, what she's been doing with colleagues in Spain and elsewhere, and some of the insights around these modeling techniques that give us some pointers about how we get better insights with respect to sustainable lifestyles through to 2050. Liz, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Simon. It's a pleasure to join the webinar and to describe the work that Cranfield's been doing in collaboration with our partners, of course, across the whole EU-InnovatE project. So thank you for the introduction. So I guess our central research questions, the problems that we were trying to address, can be sort of boiled down to these three. So firstly, are there scenarios of domestic consumption behaviours which achieve sustainable lifestyles? So we already knew that from the spread work that you referred to earlier, that actually lifestyles are unsustainable. And of course, with growth in populations, with growth in consumption, they continue to remain unsustainable. So we wanted to see, were there ways in which households' consumption could change in order to be sustainable. And we did this by looking at the configurations of different lifestyles, the behaviours of those lifestyles, and the environments that they belonged in. Now, the second research problem was, can the transition from contemporary, so from today's lifestyles, be achieved towards sustainable lifestyles with the help of sustainable user innovation? Now, we're only interested in household consumption here, so it's about domestic consumption. So could we find some way to transition from today towards these sustainable lifestyles? And to what extent would a sustainable user innovation contribute towards that aim? And then thirdly, how would we actually achieve this transition? What pathway would we want to progress? Which innovations would have the most benefit soonest, and therefore would be most ideal to take up first? Okay, so that's the summary. We're going to just delve a little bit more deeply in the next slide. So perhaps I can move on to the next one. And I suppose our three areas of research for the sustainable innovation model were the domain of innovation itself, which is full of key performance indicators and scorecards, masses of innovation generally, but only some small part of it focusing on sustainability, where we have this overlap with SOI, sustainability-oriented innovation. So already we have some idea that innovations can be towards sustainability. But what we were adding with this project was this notion of user participation, user co-creation, co-production, active participation and adoption of innovations that would lead to sustainable practices. Okay, next slide please. And so our approach in the EU-InnovatE model was actually sevenfold. So there are sort of 7 aspects that I'm going to cover in the next 7 slides. And quickly to summarise them here, the first was that we wanted to create an artificial society that was representative of any scale of community. So this is so that we can create a model of a society. The second was to measure the performance of that society's consumption. And that society could be either a society today or some future society that we think actually is sustainable, but would our model tell us that yes, it was sustainable or not? The third approach was to evaluate in these 4 domains of food, energy, living and mobility, what would actually be the impact of the adoption of particular user innovations upon sustainability performance. So we had to do some measuring about impact of adoption of innovation. The fourth point was a method to increase the acceleration of adoption. How could we speed up the adoption behaviour so that we could show that there was an advantage to be gained by the introduction of policies or changes to the way society was governed? Fifth point was to analyse the transition pathways to actually see what impact they had. The fourth one was to make sure that we grounded the types of innovation we presented in real-world case studies single user innovation. So all the innovations we have in the model are representative of ones in real practice. And then finally, we wanted to have something to say about where there was the greatest potential to achieve sustainable lifestyles. So how could we gauge what adoption rate was necessary in order to achieve that sort of nirvana of 8,000 kilograms per person per year, which the spread scenarios had indicated was a sustainable lifestyle. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the first point then was about simulation at any scale. So the model is able to represent any scale of society, whether it's the whole of Europe or even the world, if we wanted to, or whether it was a block of countries, maybe Nordic countries or Hispanic countries, or more granular details, at national level or subnational. So whether it's regional, and the middle picture shows the UK regions, or city level, or even more detailed. The challenge is, have we got the data to populate the scenario template for the model for the scale of society we want to represent? And mostly we found that data was available very easily actually at national level, but and subnational is proving actually not that difficult, but maybe supranational would involve some averaging, which might mean that we don't get such accurate results for the location that you might be wanting to model. But we can model at any scale. So this was an important consideration in the model. So next slide, please. Now, in order to measure performance, spread really led our thinking in this area in terms of kilograms footprint per person per year. And indeed, the 4 sustainable scenarios that they developed, including the singular super champions, the governing the commons, the local loops, and the empathetic communities. Each one of these 4 scenarios had a per capita consumption of 8,000 kilograms per person per year. So what we were trying to do was represent that kilograms consumption within our models. You can see that there are 4 categories of kilograms consumption. There's this other category, which is other than energy, food, housing and mobility. So we haven't dealt with that other category in the model. It's just the first 4 domains that we were interested in. Now, we actually introduced a second measure into our model, which was about carbon dioxide emissions. Now, this is a fundamental measure for environmentally sustainable assessment. So therefore, not just measuring the kilograms consumption, we also show the emissions, not just overall, but actually we divide it between domestic emissions and mobility emissions. So we can show the impact in each of these domains. Okay, next slide, please. The third area for the model was about evaluating the impact, and immediately when we started using the model, we could see that actually the impacts were not always intuitive. So we take this extreme example really in the UK, where we've adopted, or 45% of households have adopted electric vehicles. Now you see from the top grey line that actually the CO2 emissions have slightly gone up over the 35 years run of the model. Now what's happened is, of course, the mobility emissions, the orange line at the bottom, have gone down commensurate with the adoption of this proportion of electric vehicles. But actually the domestic emissions have gone up because what we're doing is replacing fuel from fossil fuels in cars, petrol and diesel fuel, by the electricity that's produced in domestic homes, which is largely in the UK from fossil fuels. So we're compensating domestic emissions output by mobility emissions. So there's very little change, so very little advantage to adopting electric vehicles in the UK. We run this innovation through in different countries, and actually we have very different results. So next slide, please. Now, a key part of the modelling thinking was about how could we accelerate the adoption of innovation. Now, we recognise that there are inert households, and in fact that there are a proportion of households which always remain inert. But actually there's a proportion of households who start inert but actually become converted. And this sort of traditional sigmoid curve innovation diffusion model sort of typically represents the sort of rate and acceleration of adoption of innovations. So once you get this early adopters and the early majority, actually you get a very fast rate of adoption by the late majority and the laggards. So what we've introduced to the model is an input sheet, which is an adoption percentage. Now this adoption percentage is based on the percentage of people who haven't yet adopted and who are no longer inert. So as the inert population goes down, the adopters can increase. So we can represent the diffusion equation very well. And this adoption percentage can go up or down based on whether we have policies that are encouraging this specific type of innovation or not. So if an example in the UK is a renewable heat incentive, so the adoption of solar panels would go up with an incentive such as that in place. So you can run the model with an adoption, maybe a 2 or 3% adoption rate without an incentive, and maybe a 15 to 20% adoption rate with the incentive, and you can see the difference between the two runs. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and then the model is also concerned then with working out the transition pathways. And we've done some detailed work on the different types of innovation so the impact of the different types of innovation and what order we might want to do these in. And the transition pathways work very much highlights the point about scenario context. Now this means that the initial conditions, so the starting point of the particular society that we're representing is key in terms of what transition selection methods we use. So we can see here already, if we just compare UK and Germany and look at all the innovations, if we've aggregated all the innovations within the model and shown that the same adoption rate of innovations has different results depending on the scenario. So you can see overall that for living, there's a 61% improvement from the innovations in Germany, but a 67% improvement in the UK just for the living scenarios. So and in fact, each one of these percentages vary, and it does depend on the initial conditions we start with. So some innovations are better in different countries, and the transition towards them is dependent entirely on the initial conditions. Okay, next slide, please. Now, this is just to demonstrate that we created an integrated model where we have overlapping domains of mobility, living, food, and energy. And this diagram describes where our case studies have been placed. So, for example, Codify is an entirely energy-based case study. But when we look at the BMW i case study, which was the electric vehicle case study, you can see it's already overlapping between mobility and energy. And some overlap entirely. So the food assembly is a good example of energy, food, and living overlapping. So, in fact, we created an integrated model so that we could deal with the innovations across all of these areas in one model. Okay, thank you. Next slide. And these case studies led us to define innovation types. So, for an example, in mobility, innovations could lead to a reduction in kilometres travelled, or maybe a change in mode. So, a mobility innovation which caused the household to move some of its transport requirements from car use to public transport would be an innovation which would change the mode of mobility. And we have the same in the other domains. So in food, we might have an innovation that reduced the food waste, or in energy, something that reduced consumption. So, but maybe we had an innovation which required a behaviour that reduced the consumption of some, say, water products, which could then reduce energy needs. Okay, next slide, please. And we've also measured the outcomes of the adoption by looking at the magnitude of the impact of adoption in kilograms, as well as obviously in the emissions. And we can do comparative studies of the different types of innovation and see where the major impacts are. And we can see already that, reducing kilometres, reducing food, just behaviour that is resource reduction oriented is already making the biggest impact through sort of graphical charts such as these. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so just on reflection, if you like, whenever we make a model, we try to represent reality, but the model is not reality, it's not the real thing. So Magritte's quite well-known picture of Safina's Power Pipe is of course very relevant. The picture is a picture of a pipe, it's not the pipe itself. So the model is not reality, it's just a representation of reality. And what this means is that we've made simplifications, we've selected assumptions, we've made the model usable without taking away too much from reality, but it's not reality itself. So it's a simplification, and we always have to bear in mind that simplifications, we might lose things in the simplification process. So we can't be sure a model's absolutely accurate for everything. Okay, thank you. Next slide. Okay, thank you. So three emerging findings, in summary. So in each of these domains, food, energy, living and mobility, we can represent household consumption, and if we take the sum of all the innovation types that we can see the potential to transition existing European society towards sustainable levels of consumption. So this is quite a big effort, and it's a massive scale of adoption, and it's adoption in every single domain. So we need the sum of all these together to get us towards sustainable levels of consumption. So quite a lot needs to be done, essentially, to get to that sort of nirvana of sustainable society. The second emerging finding is about public policies and societal interventions. Certainly they have the potential to accelerate these sustainable innovations, and the model gives us a quantifiable effect on carbon emissions and kilograms consumption. So we can immediately see which ones have the most benefits. And thirdly, systemic innovations that represent changes or describe a potential future, such as the spread scenarios, actually show that we can have alternative ways of meeting sustainable consumption targets. So we can immediately, with the model, try to represent, for example, the UK, not as a fossil fuel intensive energy generation mix, but if we were to, assume that there was wind generation, say for 80% of our fuel needs, we can immediately see the impact of that on sustainable lifestyles and on kilograms output and emissions. So already the model can do these what-ifs very, very easily. Okay, thank you. Next slide. And we've implemented the model into a web-accessible, open access solution. We have a number of tabs. I've just taken a screenshot here of the Create a New Experiment tab. You create a new experiment by giving it a name and a description, and you essentially select the scenario you want to model, and we have some default scenarios in there for the different countries and for the spread scenarios. You select the innovation you want to examine, and you introduce the policy template. So this is about the adoption. So how much adoption is there going to be? Is it with or without policy? And you run the model, and immediately you can see the experiments under the Experiments tab, and you can compare experiments. So you might run a baseline model just of the UK to see how it's performing now, and you might run another experiment with the adoption of, the electric vehicles to show what's changed. And you can compare those experiments online using that Experiments tab. So again, a very nice visualization. You can also download the specific spreadsheets that are created, so you have access to the underlying information via the model interface. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and just in summary, to say that our component in Cranfield formed part of a larger work piece that was the Work Package 5. Our colleagues in Asada led the measurement markers review and the midterm project synthesis, to which we contributed, and we were involved in the steps 3 and 4, which was the design and simulation of an EU-InnovatE model, and also we had an expert evaluation panel, and we've incorporated some redesign and iteration of the model as a result of that. I think that may be my last slide. Thank you.
Liz, thank you. That was, as always, fascinating and very much appreciated. I think out of all of our colleagues in EU-InnovatE, you probably have the most challenging task. Trying to simplify the very complex work that's been done into digestible and understandable packages. But I think that's really very helpful and
thank you.
Actually, just if I can, to pick up on the conversation that we had before the webinar actually began. In terms of the potential value of this model and its potential users, what do you see as the way in which this can help different stakeholders as a platform or software, or also just a way of thinking about impact measurement of new approaches? How does that translate into sort of public policy, or even maybe for big companies or smaller companies or other actors who are trying to get their heads around these complex issues of assessing future impacts of acting in one way or another?
Okay, so thank you for the question. I think, so in terms of public policy, this is a really interesting question, and we are in fact working with a city in the UK using this model. And what we're trying to do there is to show the effects of policy changes on sustainable mobility. So specifically, we're trying to see, are there incentives that we could give the population that would enable them to transition towards more public transport choices, but also towards more walking and cycling and being more active cities. Now, already we can give them a baseline because the city level data is largely available, and we can already start modelling with them, the what if scenarios. So what if, this number of people were no longer using their cars, but they were walking for some of their journeys? But more importantly, what about the impact of particular innovations or policy interventions that would help to move that on? So if we had the introduction, say, of an innovation which was like a Segway, one of these portable drive along vehicles, we could immediately model the impact of something like that on emissions and kilogram consumption. Now, for the commercial and the sort of private sector, we see this relevant for large and small companies because they can already see the impact of what their innovations would do to sustainable lifestyles and also to carbon emissions, so to their environmental impact. So they could experiment with different adoption rates. And of course, once adoption is not linear. So if you increase adoption, eventually you'll get, the returns of adoption reduce. So there'll be a peak number of adopters relevant to their particular type of innovation. Some people, some of the households in the model won't be able to adopt because they won't have the right characteristics for adoption. So if you're introducing an innovation which is, for example, innovating people who already drive petrol vehicles, if you haven't got a petrol vehicle in the household, you're not going to adopt. So you're not going to catch that population. So immediately they can also already see the extent of the potential adopters, and they'll also see the impact of it. And I think also this is relevant for small companies because they can also provide business cases for the impact of their innovation. So if you have, one of the innovations we looked at was a food assembly innovation. So if a food assembly innovation is implemented into a society, then how could that help with reduced mobility needs? So if the farm comes to you, you can then walk to the market and therefore replace food and all the packaging and extra kilograms that you don't need by things bought immediately from a marketplace. So you have impacts on food, on mobility, potentially on energy consumption, because if the foods need different preparation, you're changing your diet so you don't have food energy needs in the same way as you did before. So immediately, small businesses and even large businesses who are trying to experiment with the potential for products to impact sustainable lifestyles can examine what their innovation would affect.
Comprehensive and very much appreciated. I mean, I think certainly as we've watched the development of this model and some of the surrounding activities, it's become very clear that this is, I think, one of the lesser spotted examples of a genuinely tangible product that has relevance coming out of one of these sort of large-scale EU-funded research projects. It has relevance and materiality for all different types of stakeholders. And I think, as you highlighted a little earlier, it's not purely dependent on how much data you have, that you can actually run this with a series of what-ifs. So if you have a very good process in terms of identifying variables and parameters and the kinds of questions or alternative realities that you want to test, it doesn't, it's not predicated on you having huge volumes of data to just plug into sort of a high-powered computing system.
Yeah, so that's totally right, Simon. The beauty of our modelling approach is that we actually create great diversity in our simulated population. So although we have statistically correct information for the scenario, when we instantiate it into the actual simulated society, we're creating diverse households which attempt to replicate what society actually looks like. So we have some households who have one occupant but may have 3 cars, because that's how society is. We have these oddball effects of society. So our model can give us quite good insight into the diverse range of households, but actually the data sets we need are statistically correct. So not too demanding for users of the model, but actually through the implementation of the model, we've actually enabled that diversity to come about. And just while I have the opportunity to say, when we populate our simulated society, we do this on some basis of 100 iterations. And what we do is take the average of the 100 iterations. So for every experiment you do, we do 100. And we give you some 95% confidence interval about our results. So you can see the highs and lows for your particular experiment.
Fantastic. Now, I realise I've been very greedy as I started with it. Does anybody with us this afternoon who would actually like to ask a question to Liz, or make a comment, or feedback or observation? If not, then quite understand. But we're just going to unmute people, so give you the opportunity now. Just simply need to speak up and make sure that your computer or your microphone is off mute, and to see whether there's any immediate feedback or questions from it. If not, I have a couple more. But I think it's important to be egalitarian about this. Okay. Not initially. So, Liz, in the absence of any immediate questions, if I can, I just ask for another one. So we also have this sort of captured for posterity for when the webinar and the recording goes online. You talked quite a lot earlier about sort of the collation of all innovations. And I think for people who are coming fresh to this type of approach and model, perhaps it would help to sort of really break down how you define innovation in different ways and how you use that as part of the variable or the variable or do you look at it from other dimensions as well?
Okay, yeah, thank you for the question. Yes. So we looked at every single case study that was generated in Work Package 3 and in Work Package 4. So essentially we broke down the innovation in terms of the effect it had on behaviour. So what impact would it have on behaviour? So, but we had some innovations which were bundles of other innovations. So, for example, we had one which was on community living, where essentially a number of families who lived in maybe traditional 2, 3, 4-person households would decide to buy a much bigger property and have a shared kitchen and shared facilities, which enabled much more per person energy efficiency. So essentially you aggregated the numbers of innovations you could do in this sort of community living innovation. So, but in terms of the individual innovations, we could even implement those as different innovation types. So in mobility, you could reduce your kilometres, you could change the source of your fuel, in the same way for cooking. You know, if the household energy mix was largely coming from fossil fuels, say from oil or from gas, central heating, and therefore electric power, then what would happen if we had an innovation which maybe a new form of product, such as a cooker which was using biomass or solid fuel? If we change that food cooking energy source to something different by the procurement of that product by a large number of households, we can immediately tell the impact of that. So what we're trying to do is try to understand the fundamental contributors of an innovation towards sustainability. And largely that was about changing behaviours. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I'm sure there's also a very interesting dimension about behavioural science. Statistics behind this and what it is that also create these effective nudge factors and incentives. I mean, you referenced earlier this question of providing incentives at the level of consumers and households. Is this very much part of the what ifs, the hypotheticals? Or you actually, I mean, for example, in the case of the UK city where you've been testing this model in